He did not breathe. They did not breathe. They stood. Then they turned and quietly trotted on. When he got back to the house, Boyd was awake, but he didn't tell him where he'd been nor what he'd seen. He never told anybody. The winter that Boyd turned 14, the trees inhabiting the dry riverbed were bare from early on, and the sky was gray day after day, and the trees were pale against it. A cold wind had come down from the north, with the earth running under bare poles toward a reckoning, whose ledgers would be drawn up and dated only long after all due claims had passed. Such is this history. Among the pale cottonwoods with their limbs like bones and their trunks sloughing off the pale or green or darker bark, clustered in the outer bend of the riverbed below the house, stood trees so massive that in the stand across the river was a sawed stump, upon which in winters past herders had pitched a 4-by-6-foot canvas supply tent for the wooden floor it gave. Riding out for wood, he watched his shadow and the shadow of the horse and travois cross those palings tree by tree. Boyd rode in the travois, holding the axe as if he'd keep guard over the wood they'd gathered. And he watched to the west with squinted eyes where the sun simmered in a dry red lake under the barren mountains, and the antelope stepped and nodded among the cattle in silhouette upon the foreland plain. They crossed through the dried leaves on the riverbed and rode till they came to a tank or pothole in the river, and he dismounted and watered the horse while Boyd walked the shore looking for muskrat sign. The Indian Boyd passed, crouching on his heels, did not even raise his eyes, so that when he sensed him there and turned, the Indian was looking at his belt and did not lift his eyes even then until he'd stopped altogether. He could have reached and touched him. The Indian squatting under a thin stand of carrizo cane and not even hidden, and yet Boyd had not seen him. He was holding across his knees an old single-shot .32 rimfire rifle, and he had been waiting in the dusk for something to come to water for him to kill. He looked into the eyes of the boy into his, eyes so dark they seemed all pupil, eyes in which the sun was setting, in which the child stood beside the sun. He had not known that you could see yourself in others' eyes, nor see therein such things as suns. He stood twinned in those dark wells with hair so pale, so thin and strange, the self-same child. As if it were some cognate child to him that had been lost, who now stood windowed away in another world, where the red sun sank eternally. As if it were a maze where these orphans of his heart had miswandered in their journey in life, and so arrived at last beyond the wall of that antique gaze from whence there could be no way back forever. From where he stood, he could not see his brother or the horse. He could see the slow rings moving out over the water where the horse stood drinking beyond the stand of cane, and he could see the slight flecks of the muscle beneath the skin of the Indian's lean and hairless jaw. The Indian turned and looked at the tank. The only sound was the dripping of water from the horse's raised muzzle. He looked at the boy. "You little son of a bitch," he said. "I ain't done nothing." "Who's that with you?" "My brother." "How old's he?" 16. The Indian stood up. He stood immediately and without effort, and looked across the tank where Billy stood holding the horse, and then he looked at Boyd again. He wore an old tattered blanket coat and an old greasy Stetson with the crown belled out, and his boots were mended with wire. "What are you all doing out here?" "Getting wood." "You got anything to eat?" "No." "Where you live at?" The boy hesitated. "I asked you where you lived at." He gestured downriver. "How far?" "I don't know." "You little son of a bitch." He put the rifle over his shoulder and walked out down the shore of the tank and stood looking across at the horse and at Billy. "Howdy," said Billy. The Indian spat. "Spooked everything in the country, ain't you?" he said. "We didn't know there was anybody here." "You ain't got nothing to eat?" "No, sir." "Where you live at?" "About 2 miles down the river." "You got anything to eat at your house?" "Yes, sir." "I come down."